going to start allowing the attendees in, or are they already in?
They're already in. Once you
Oh,
hit
wow.
start webinar, we have our guests.
Amazing. Perfect.
Yes. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am just going to give some quick housekeeping for folks. We do have CART available today. If you would like to use CART, please look at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little rectangle that has the letter C in it twice, CC for closed captioning. If you click that button, it will show your captions. If you want to hide the captions, you just have to click the button again. We do have the chat should be turned off for today, but if you have questions, we will hopefully have time at the end for questions and answers. You can put your questions in the Q&A box, and you can access that by there is another rectangular speech bubble box that has a question mark inside of it and the letters Q&A underneath it. If you click that, and you can type in your questions there. Um, that is all the housekeeping we have. So I will be turning things over to our guest speaker today, who we're very happy to have join us. Marissa Duskowski, would you like to take the floor?
Yeah. Hi everyone. My name is Marissa Ditkowski. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with dark hair that's pulled back and glasses. I am the volunteer executive director of Crip the Law. Um, we are a nonprofit. We're a national association that's created by and for disabled legal professionals. We define that pretty broadly. So that's lawyers, judges, policy folks, legislators, academics, and paralegals, legal secretaries, all other legal workers. We help disabled legal professionals by publishing resources. We host events, we do trainings, we have a mentorship program, we do policy and systemic advocacy, and we provide direct support to folks experiencing ableism within the profession. I am a multiply disabled person. I am openly autistic and neurodivergent, among other things. And full time, I am a legal services lawyer in DC working on consumer and disability rights. So I am just a couple of housekeeping notes from my end as well. Just a reminder about the closed captions. Please feel free to, get up and stim, like do whatever it is that you need to do. And if you have any other access needs, I don't know if there's an email address to email the organizers or to put something in a Q&A or whatever, because I think the chat is closed, but just as a quick note, I will go ahead and share my screen to start the presentation. Okay. Slideshow, play from start. Okay. Can everybody see the screen?
Yeah,
I'm
I can
hoping
see your
yes.
slides.
Okay, great. We went through some of this already. So we're going to talk a little bit about your rights in the workplace. There are a couple of things that I want to kind of level set on. What is a disability? Great question. There is no one definition of disability. In fact, there are a number of definitions of disability, just in federal law. Um, there are a number of models on disability, charity model, where, folks are kind of viewed as something that needs to be cured or is a punishment or something like that. The medical model, which is very focused on your symptoms, your limitations, also kind of viewing things as something that needs to be cured. And then you have the social model, which views disabilities as something that is created by our environments. Like, for example, if I use a wheelchair, I don't have a disability if the world is made accessible through ramps, for just as an example. Um, and none of those models are necessarily models that perfectly fit my view, but there are many models. There's also disability justice framework, which kind of um, emphasizes intersectionality, which just kind of means we're taking everybody's different identities into account. And we're elevating the perspectives and voices of folks who are most marginalized. So, thinking about race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, um, all of that stuff, in addition to disability and coming and being our whole selves. Um, the main definition we're going to focus on today is the civil rights definition, the one that you might hear with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We'll get to what's the ADA. We'll get to what that is in a second, but it's a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. Um, Major life activities are things like sleeping and walking, breathing, eating. It could also be like bodily functions, like how your immune system works, your endocrine system, which is like your hormones, your gastrointestinal system, so like your stomach and your intestines and all of that stuff is covered. You can also be considered protected under the ADA if you have a record of having an impairment or you're viewed as having an impairment. So the ADA is, the landmark legislation or law from 1990 was when it was signed. It's really um, the major disability rights law that covers all aspects of our lives. When we go to the grocery store, if we're, dealing with workplace, which we'll talk about today. There are some other laws that were earlier on that we'll talk a little bit about after this. But the ADA is really the big one that I'm sure you all hear about. There are a couple of titles in the law. Titles are just kind of like sections of the law. Um, Title 1 of the ADA makes disability discrimination illegal for employers who have 15 or more employees. Um, doesn't protect somebody who's an independent contractor. So that would mean that you aren't an employee. Usually that's somebody who makes their own hours or has a contract with a company or something, and they are just kind of doing a project on their own or something like that, right? There are a lot of different factors to consider about whether somebody is an independent contractor, but usually it has to do with the control that they have over their hours and how they do things. If you do have something under Title One that you want to bring, you usually only have about 180 days to 360 days. It just depends on what state you live in. Because some states have kind of an extension on that 180-day um, federal deadline. Then you have Title II of the ADA. that makes discrimination by state or local programs or services illegal. So if you work for a state or local court or in a government agency of a state or a county or something like that. So both titles, when we talk about what disability discrimination is, that includes failure to provide a reasonable accommodation. And we'll talk a little bit about what a reasonable accommodation is later on. But we're going to go through the rest of the laws first. The other law that might come up is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that makes disability discrimination illegal for anywhere that gets federal funding or a federal agency. Federal agencies might be like the Department of Education or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or one of those. Examples of workplaces that get federal funding, you might work at a nonprofit, for example, that gets a grant or other money from the federal government. Those kinds of things. Okay. Other laws or requirements, there might be state or local laws that create more protections for you. Some examples, like UNRWA in California. In DC, we have the Human Rights Act, and that actually makes it so that any employer has to avoid disability discrimination. Even if you just have one employee in DC, you are covered. So that goes farther than the ADA, which says that the employer has to have 15 or more employees. So there also might be protections or accommodations required based on like employee manuals or contracts. Like, if your employer enters into a contract to get funding, right? They might have to agree to non-discrimination. Or, not discriminating against disabled workers, even if they have, three employees as opposed to 15. So those kinds of things. What are your rights in your job? Number one is getting reasonable accommodations. Again, we'll talk about what that means later. Um, to not be discriminated against. So that might mean like calling you names, treating you poorly because of your disability, refusing to hire or promote you because of your disability, firing you because of your disability, all of that. In a lot of cases, managers sharing information about your disability to your coworkers could also violate federal law. It just depends on kind of who's on a need to know basis, among other things. Giving you less pay or benefits because of your disability is also illegal. Except for if an employer has a certificate, basically, to be allowed to pay disabled workers below the minimum wage, or the lowest amount that you can usually pay a worker per hour. Though a lot of states have now outlawed sub-minimum wage jobs, and obviously it is pretty problematic, but it is still federal law to allow for sub-minimum wages to be paid to disabled workers. Okay, so the only people who are protected are not just people with disabilities, but you have to be a qualified person with a disability. So, what does that mean? It means that you can do all of the quote unquote essential functions of your job with or without accommodation. And you don't pose any kind of safety threat to yourself or to others doing this job. What is an essential function? It's your basic job duties. There are a couple ways we figure out what those are. What the employer says is one of those things, but it is not the only factor. There's also written job descriptions, the amount of time you spend doing something, what happens if you can't do something, the terms of a union contract, and the work experience of others who have had or now have the same role that you do. What is not an essential function? Often we see very uh, broad duties listed in postings that kind of weed out disabled workers. Those are also not allowed. Some examples that we see, like in the legal profession, for example, standing, crawling, lifting. There's also sometimes requirements for spoken communication, even though we know that a lot of folks, use sign language and, are able to communicate that way. I do see a bunch of questions in the chat, but we will get to the Q&A toward the end, so just bear with me while you can. Okay, I promised you we would get to this piece. What is a reasonable accommodation? It just means a change in your environment, in a process, in a policy, that allows someone with a disability to do their job. It helps disabled folks get what they need to be successful, whether that's at a job, at school, or somewhere else. Some accommodations are free. Some, like captioning or other things may not be. The vast majority of accommodations that people ask for are either free or below $500. There are some exceptions to consider when we're thinking about whether something is a reasonable accommodation, because we have that word reasonable there. If something is an undue burden on an employer, so that's usually based on things like cost or the size of the company, how much the accommodation helps, or if something's what's called a fundamental alteration, and that's a major change to the program or what the employer does or what the employer needs. Now, sometimes employers use these things to deny people accommodations when they really shouldn't. They are used illegally sometimes. But this is just, what the law says and figuring out whether something is a reasonable accommodation. Then we think about an accommodation versus accessibility. Like we said, an accommodation is an exception to a rule. You have to go through a special process to get it, usually. Accessibility means there's a focus on making something accessible to as many people as possible from the get-go. There's often a lot of a focus on doing the bare minimum you have to do under the law. But as we say, the ADA is the floor, not the ceiling. So we do hope that employers go above and beyond to actually create inclusive spaces for disabled workers. Here are some examples of reasonable accommodations. Captions, written instructions, clear feedback. Obviously, providing cleared feedback is something that effective managers do for everyone, but they are particularly important for neurodivergent folks, myself included. I'm one of those people who, in accommodation, is always really clear feedback. Sometimes, more time to complete things, flexible schedules, private office or noise canceling headphones or a distraction-free environment, having something to record in meetings or for note taking, changing fluorescent lighting. If you're looking for more examples, I highly recommend visiting the Job Accommodation Network website. That's askjan.org. They have a whole like A to Z list of different accommodations. They also have an A to Z list based on disability. Obviously, it's not gonna cover every single thing, but they have a really great resource and list of everything. We also want to keep in mind multiply marginalized disabled workers, disabled people of color, members of the LGBTQIA to Spirit Plus community, and other multiply marginalized disabled folks may have unique experiences of discrimination in the workplace or elsewhere. There also might be other civil rights laws that apply if there's discrimination in any other way, like based on sex or race or sexual orientation, gender identity, along with disability discrimination. Um, Multiply marginalized disabled folks may also experience disability differently, with different stigmas and expectations and cultural connotations and assumptions. Okay, how do we get accommodations? Um, when do we ask for accommodations? People ask this question all the time. When do I disclose my disability? When do I ask for accommodations? Um, there is no right time to tell your employer about your disability. It is a really personal decision. I know for me personally, honestly, if somebody Googles me, they'll know. But I even like to include it in my application because I just like to know right up front, is this going to be a good environment for me? And I also feel that it really helps and shows, my different strengths and the perspective that I come from and makes me unique. But there also is always that risk that somebody is going to use it to discriminate against you. But that is my personal choice. Everybody makes their own choice. The only hard and fast rule that I would recommend is that if you need accommodations, you should tell your employer ASAP. Because if your employer decides to fire you or demote you or something else because of maybe a performance issue that's related to your disability, and you didn't tell them about your disability before, then they don't have to go back on their decision. So make sure you ask for those accommodations before any issues come up. Um, or to disclose your disability. You're not supposed to have to use any magic words, but we'll talk about that in a second. You can get accommodations for the application process, the interview process, once you're in your role. So all of those places. How do I ask for accommodations? Again, there's no magic word that you should have to use. Once your employer knows that you have a disability and needs something to help you do your job, they should be telling you if there's a process for requesting accommodations. Is there a form? What do you have to submit? But the process has to be reasonable. They can't, be asking for, your birth certificate, like, you know, your, whatever random document that's hard to, I don't know, whatever. It has to be a reasonable process. Sometimes they'll ask for a doctor's note or for a doctor to fill out a form. But it can't be, so difficult that, or burdensome that it's not reasonable. Um, you shouldn't need to share your exact diagnosis, just what your limitations are and how certain accommodations can help you do your job. So, for example, I have muscular dystrophy, but if I submit an accommodation request, my doctor can say, Marissa struggles to type. She gets tired when she's typing, and her arms start to hurt. So she needs dictation software to help her do that job, to, do that essential duty or function of her job, which is, writing, legal briefs. The interactive process, you might have heard this term before, but once you ask for an accommodation, your employer might say that, what you're requesting isn't possible or reasonable for some reason. If that happens, though, your employer has to have a conversation with you so you can find something that works for you, and for them, right? That's called the interactive process. Um, they have to engage in it. They can't just deny you outright and not have a conversation with you about it. Um, and they can't just, put it off and not have any conversation at all. But the accommodation still has to be effective, or, it has to do what you need it to do, to get the help that you need. What does a denial look like? So it's not always just somebody saying no. Um, if your employer doesn't engage in that interactive process, um, and they say they won't, um, you know, uh, and they say that they won't, oh my goodness. Uh, so sorry. Um, that doesn't make any sense. But if your employer doesn't engage in that interactive process, um, and they don't do anything else, um, and they just say no, to your first request, that's a denial, obviously. If your employer does engage in the interactive process and still says no at the end, that's also a denial. If your employer drags on the process for a really long time, or says yes but really doesn't do anything to put your accommodation into place, that could also be considered a denial. If your request is denied, every workplace has a different process. You might be able to go off the chain, up the chain, file an appeal. If you have a union, there might also be, a grievance process, that we could talk a little bit more about later. If you don't have a union, though, you could still organize, with the people you work with to fight to be treated fairly in the workplace and have those workplace protections. You might be able to file a complaint that I'll also explain later. And you might want to get advice from a lawyer. I'll also talk about that later on. Where can you get help? State and federal agencies. So you can potentially file a complaint, with a federal office, that works in employment discrimination, like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the EEOC, or a state agency, like in DC, we have the Office of Human Rights. In California, there's the Civil Rights Department, and so on. You might also be able to get help from your state's vocational rehabilitation program. Every state has one. There's also vocational rehabilitation programs in territories. They might be able to help you get a job or keep a job. They could provide training or financial help to go to school or get equipment that you need, in order to work. Obviously, friends, family, loved ones, are a huge source of support. We all rely on people in our lives to provide that support, whether that helps us make decisions, or help us emotionally. Coworkers and unions. Unions exist in a lot of workplaces, to help build power in community. Unions, they'll usually enter into a contract, like, that's often called a collective bargaining agreement, if you've ever heard that term. But they'll enter a contract with your employer, just to make sure you all have certain rights in the workplace. So one of those rights could be, related to discrimination. You might be able to file something with your union, if your employer breaks the law, or if they violate one of the, parts of the contract that talks about providing accommodations or accessibility. The union might also be able to support you to fight back, even if there, isn't a certain grievance procedure. And even without a union, you might have coworkers, that you can trust and can help you organize. Not everyone is comfortable with or feels safe to talk to coworkers or their union. That's okay. You can get help in other ways. Disability organizations, not every disability organization can give legal advice. Many can give some guidance or share how they've navigated similar situations, give you resources or give you referrals. That's kind of how crypto law is. We do this for disabled law students and legal professionals. We don't represent people or give legal advice, but we do, provide guidance or talk about our own experiences and share resources. Um, if you can't work something out with your employer, it might be time to talk with a lawyer. They can help you file a case against an employer who breaks the law. You'll need to find somebody who has a license in your state. Sometimes your local protection and advocacy programs, which are basically funded just to fight for the rights of disabled folks. In DC, for example, we have Disability Rights DC. They might take employment discrimination cases, but some do not. You can go to them and see. If they don't, they might have referrals, but you can definitely try them as a first step. And Crypto Law is always happy to provide referrals if we can. There's also the Disability Rights Bar Association. On their website, there is a list of members, and you can find them by state as well. So, some additional info. I've included some um, websites. Obviously, the Autistic Self Advocacy Network is one of those resources, but there's also cryptolaw.org. There's indulsa.org, NDLSA.org. That's for the National Disabled Law Students Association. Like we talked about, there's the Job Accommodation Network for that whole list of examples, and they have a lot of resources. That's askjan.org. The Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network is also a great resource. The Autistic People of Color Fund is also a great resource. Obviously, there are also so many resources for folks who are neurodivergent, which, as we know, neurodivergence is a pretty broad term that encompasses like a lot of different disabilities. If you want to contact me directly, I recommend email versus the phone since the phone's just kind of a Google Voice number. But my email address is mditkowski. That's M as in Mary, D as in dog, ITKOWSKY at cryptolaw.org. I will stop sharing now, and there are a bunch of questions. I see, and thank you to Alex for putting my info in the chat. I really appreciate it. Um, okay, so Sarah has a question. Does an employee have recourse if HR is unresponsive to repeated requests for ADA accommodations? Yes. I think we talked a little bit about that. If there really is a delay, they're not responding, then that could be considered a denial of accommodation. So, you potentially have rights there. If you are experiencing an issue and need legal advice, always happy to try to provide those resources. Um, I see Megan says that discrimination really upsets them. Um, I appreciate, what folks are really going through with that. I've been there. It's really tough. Okay. What if I'm afraid to have documentation that says I have a disability, given the current political climate? Does ADA still apply when DEI is gone in the government? Oof. I think that's a really good question because when we talk about our rights and the law, that implies your employer cares about the law. Um, that is particularly an issue when it comes to the federal government right now. Um, so does it still apply? Yes. In theory, right, we still have the ADA, even if we're not saying the words diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Um, we still have civil rights laws that exist, right? Like employers can't, in theory, discriminate on the basis of race or sex or any of that. But they have, right? The ADA is like 36 years old almost now, and employers have violated the law and continue to violate the law, regardless of whether it exists. Um, so, I mean, I think that does it still apply? Yes. What's going to happen in practice? That's a different question. And when we don't have federal agencies who are interested in enforcing the law, that is also a really big access to justice problem. Because we don't have the support we need, and it's hard for folks to bring lawsuits. Um, I don't know if that answered your question or made folks more depressed, but there you go. Um, a question I'm seeing, thoughts on accommodations to work remotely, when your job can be fully done remotely, but you get pushback because it's not reasonable. Um, Great question. It is not an uncommon experience. I have personally had this experience before. Um, there are a lot of employers who um, don't care that we were able to do jobs perfectly well during um, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't want to say during the pandemic because we're still in the pandemic. So, um, I think a lot of employers have been forcing folks to go back in person, um, even when it's not necessary. Um, I think a lot of that has to do with control. Um, but in theory, yeah, remote work can be a reasonable accommodation. Um, but there's always going to be a case by case question, right? Is it reasonable in your case? I don't know. Based on, for example, if you work at a restaurant, right? Right? If you work at, let's just say you work at McDonald's or something, and you're, a cook or something like that. Working remotely is obviously not going to be a reasonable accommodation, because the essential functions of your job are to be in person. But let's say your job is to write and do research, right? Well, that can probably be done remotely. Um, but, the question is it an effective accommodation for you? Is it a necessary accommodation? And what are those essential functions? The basic duties of your job, can you do them? And then there are those factors to go through, right? Like, what happens if you don't do that, right? Um, how does that impact coworkers? What have coworkers done in the past? So happy to talk offline about that because that is something we see folks asking about all the time. And we are here for folks who are experiencing it because you are absolutely not alone. Um, okay. I see another question. My sister with IDD, that's for folks who don't know the different acronyms. That's an intellectual or developmental disability, and health issues. Works at a clothing store in the dressing room. It means that there are periods where she's standing and others where she is not because no one is in the room. General question one, when asked if a stool can be provided because she has a documented bad hip and can't stand for long periods of time, her employer said no. Does this violate reasonable accommodation? Maybe, right? There's always going to be that case by case question, um, about whether it's a reasonable accommodation. So, for example, if the job is, to put away clothing, things like that, then yeah, they might need to stand or, maybe if they use a wheelchair, they don't have to stand, but kind of move around in some way. But, there might be requirements to do that at some points. Um, but if there is a way, to do that, then it should be provided if it really is the reasonable accommodation in that situation. This is a thing that is also seen. We see it with like cashiers, for example. Why cashiers are expected to stand in the United States is very confusing to me. I don't understand. I think I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a logical reason to me. That might just be me being autistic. I don't know, but I don't understand it. Um, but that is something we see. Um, General question two, the employer only gives her one shift a week versus others who have multiple despite working there 20 years. Does this violate the law? Um, Again, it really depends. Like, why is that happening? If it's because of their disability, is there evidence that it's because of their disability? Um, like, what is the reason for, like, what is the explanation for them doing the shifts like that? It's really hard to answer that question, but like, could it be? In theory, yeah, but it just really depends. Just because it's happening, doesn't mean it's for an illegal reason. Um, okay. Shannon, okay. Um, One of the folks clarified that their sister does have a doctor's note for the chair. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's always the same question, right? Doctor's note or not, it's always going to be the same question, case by case. Is this a reasonable accommodation? Is it effective? Is it needed? Are you able to do the basic duties of the job with it? Is it an undue burden? Is it a fundamental alteration? Right? All of those questions. Um, Another question, what if the interactive process takes years? So that could be considered a denial, right? Like we talked about, a denial doesn't always look like a flat out no. Sometimes a denial looks like your employer just not doing anything, not responding, not getting to, an actual place. But I will also say, um, if you already have accommodations in place, um, and they don't work out, right? That interactive process doesn't necessarily go away either, right? Our needs are constantly changing. We might think that, we might figure out that something doesn't work for us. Um, and that is a reason to go back to your employer and say, hey, you know, this isn't really working for me. Can we figure something else out? And that's something they'll have to do. But if you can't get an accommodation at all, you're going through the interactive process forever and nothing's happening, yeah, that could be considered a denial. But other than that, if you're just trying to work it out over time and your needs change or whatever, like that process doesn't end. Employers still have, an obligation to continue to have that conversation with you. Okay. I think I answered all the questions that I see. Do you folks have other questions or did I miss anything? Um, Mods.
Think we've caught everything. Um, a practice that we sometimes do is wait a couple minutes to give folks a chance to type. Uh, but yeah, I don't see any outstanding questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Uh, if you do have a question, please type it. Uh, we don't usually have participants come on mic during our webinars. I just want to let folks know that one.
Okay. If it's an access need, just for folks who might need it as an access need, is there a way to do it? Just in case.
Thank you for framing that. Yes, I believe so. Um, Eli, you are our host, so I think you might be the one to be able to do that. Let me see. Yeah, that will be a host capability if we do have the ability to let folks come off.
Cool. Yeah, I think it would be a host thing too. Okay. Well, we'll give it a couple minutes and see if anybody else has other questions. I am muted. Thank you, Christine. Um, okay, what is a reasonable accommodation? Sorry, what is a reasonable amount of time for an accommodation that has been approved to be provided? A great question. As you will see in the law here, there is a lot of repeating of the word reasonable. And every single time the word reasonable pops up, it's always going to be a case by case decision. Um, so what is a reasonable amount of time? It depends, right? Did somebody have to go on sick leave, right? Did um something happen at your job where maybe you had to be out for a bit, and so being able to engage in the interactive process couldn't happen. So it just really depends on what's going on and why the delay is happening, right? If, it's going on for months and there's really no reason for the delay, then, that might not be a reasonable amount of time. But it just really depends on the situation. Um, so Another question. I'm organizing a grassroots organization and trying to make a workers' cooperative, or self-directed nonprofit. Is there anything in regard to liability that you think I should know about having a workers-led organization? Um, so that is a good question. Um, I think there's a lot of things related to starting your own organization, no matter what kind of organization, um, that I'm happy to talk about offline. Um, I don't necessarily know about getting into the weeds here, but I'm happy to talk about some of the things related to starting your own nonprofit or what have you, and the liability related to those types of things and provide you with some information. But I do want to say that when folks are making those workers' cooperatives or nonprofits that are really trying to, you know, organize workers, it is always important to think about disability from the beginning. Sometimes, you know, unions don't always get it right, when it comes to disability, right? Unions are run by humans, right? And so, making sure that that's a part of the work that you're doing, um, and really making it a priority and having folks in the room, who have disabilities is, really going to be important for making things better for all workers. So if the goal is to make things better for all workers, you need everybody protected. So, um, but yeah, feel free to message me offline. Okay, looking at the Q&A. I was fired after going to the EEOC. How do I keep my health benefits? That is a good question. I don't know because it really depends on folks' jobs. So it's kind of hard to say. Um, so I can't really answer that question without more information or, you know, anything like that. So, feel free to they're a VR counselor. Um, so I don't know. Typically, employers are supposed to provide something called Cobra if somebody's fired. Um, but um, that can also be kind of expensive. Um, so, you would be able to stay on your health insurance for a little bit. Usually it's just a certain amount of time that it's required. Um, but it can be expensive to do. Like Cobra is very expensive. Um, Obviously, you could always go on to the federal or state marketplace. So, there are options. And if, eventually you decide you need to apply for Social Security disability insurance or supplemental security income, which are both like Social Security, public benefits, um, you might eventually be eligible for Medicare or Medicaid, um, or something like that. Um, Okay. Chelsea said, can a part-time schedule be an accommodation if it can be done in a way that doesn't unreasonably damage the basic job function? Yeah, potentially flexible schedules could be. Often they do, um, there is an argument a lot of the time that it is an undue burden or fundamental alteration, just because if somebody has to um hire additional people or it makes more work for issues with shifts, stuff like that, um, it can be hard, and that actually makes it really hard for a lot of disabled people to find work. Because there aren't a ton of like flexible part-time jobs that meet folks' needs. And it sucks. But yeah, it can potentially be an accommodation. It just depends on, is it reasonable? A lot of times, it might not be. The other thing to know about part-time work is that you might not be eligible for benefits or health insurance for your employer, but they still might provide it to you. It's just another reason why a lot of disabled folks can't do part-time work and wind up going on the benefit train is because we need healthcare for a lot of our medical needs. So that makes it challenging. Okay. Are there any other questions? So we'll give it another couple minutes. This is Marissa. I don't see anything else.
Yeah, I think it doesn't look like we have any more questions today. Um, we can, in fact, call things in that case. Uh, Marissa, do you have any closing thoughts before we land the webinar plane?
Yeah, this is Marissa. I just want to thank y'all for having me. And as a reminder, um, please feel free to reach out to my email if you have questions. My goal is always to make sure folks feel like they're not alone and to do what I can to make that happen. So, if there's anything I can do to be supportive, let me know. Or if you have questions that I didn't answer, um, definitely feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Marissa. We've really appreciated you taking the time today with us. I'm going to drop your email in the chat again for everybody. But otherwise, thank y'all so much for taking the time with us today. And Eli, I believe you can go ahead and close out the webinar.
I was gonna say, is Megan Danzy's hand raised old, or is it?
If you can, I think you're the only one who has power to unmute Megan as host. So, Megan, if you did have something you would needed to like communicate, there we go. Okay. And also, I apologize. I think in the chat you said that you're actually Alessandra. Um, if you have, there you go.
I'm not hearing anything.
If you're speaking, we can't actually, the sound's not coming through.
They're unmuted, but there is no sound. But maybe they are. Maybe.
I did see them say have a wonderful day in the chat, so maybe it was an accident.
Perhaps. Okay, we can call it
Mhm.
here.
Yep. Thank y'all so much.
Bye, everyone.